Italy was never meant to look like this. On paper, it is a republic, a modern European democracy, full elections, parliaments, constitutions framed in glass and quoted in speeches. But power does not live on paper. Power lives elsewhere, in rooms without cameras, in decisions that never become headlines, in structures that predate governments and quietly survive them. To understand Italy, you have to unlearn what you were taught about nations. Because Italy was not built like France. It was not forged like Britain. It did not consolidate power through a single crown or a centralized state. Italy was stitched together late, violently, and unevenly. A patchwork of regions, families, banks, factories, and private interests that never truly surrendered control to Rome. Unification did not erase power, it redistributed it. And some dynasties understood this better than anyone else. They did not rule with speeches. They did not march armies through streets. They did not need thrones. They ruled through ownership, through leverage, through debt, through supply chains so deeply embedded into Europe's industrial backbone that removing them would collapse entire sectors overnight. Most people never noticed, because when power is quiet it feels natural. By the mid-20th century, Italy was rebuilding from rubble. Cities flattened, infrastructure destroyed, millions displaced. The country was desperate, poor, and exhausted. And in moments like these, history shows a pattern. Crises do not redistribute power evenly. They concentrate it. Factories needed capital. Banks needed stability. Governments needed partners who could rebuild fast without asking questions. Into this vacuum stepped families that had survived empires, monarchies, fascism, and war by doing one thing exceptionally well: adapting without ever being seen. They did not call themselves rulers. They called themselves industrialists: steel, energy, chemicals, shipping, construction, finance. These were not just sectors, they were arteries. Control them and you control the flow of modern life. Control the flow and you don't need to control the state. The state comes to you. By the 1970s, entire regions of Italy depended on a handful of private conglomerates for employment. Millions of workers, entire towns built around single plants. If production stopped, wages stopped. If wages stopped, votes shifted. Governments understood the message without it ever being spoken. This wasn't corruption in the cartoon sense. No envelopes exchanged in dark alleys. This was structural power. Legal, polite, invisible, and devastatingly effective. At their peak, these networks controlled assets worth tens of billions in today's dollars. Not in one company. Not under one logo, but spread across holding firms, offshore entities, joint ventures, and strategic partnerships that cross borders quietly. Italy was only the base. The real reach extended into Germany's manufacturing core, France's energy grid, Britain's financial markets, Eastern Europe's privatized industries after the Cold War. This was not nationalism, this was architecture, and the genius of it was perception. Italians were taught to blame chaos, bureaucracy, political instability, the revolving door of prime ministers. But behind the noise, ownership barely changed. Governments came and went, policies flipped. Crises erupted. The same names remained on the shareholder lists. When Italy's public debt ballooned past 100% of GDP, someone still had to finance it. When factories shut down, someone bought the land. When privatization swept through Europe in the 1990s, someone was waiting with capital ready. You have to understand something. Democracy governs laws, it does not govern leverage. Leverage governs outcomes, and leverage belongs to those who can afford to wait. These families never chased headlines. They let journalists chase scandals while balance sheets grew quietly. They let politicians fight while contracts stayed intact. They understood that visibility was risk. Silence was protection. By the time Europe realized how dependent it had become on private industrial networks, it was already too late. Breaking them apart would mean mass unemployment, energy shortages, supply chain collapse, political suicide. So no one tried. Instead, they negotiated, regulation softened, antitrust cases stalled. Bailouts arrived when risk turned systemic. Losses were absorbed publicly. Profits remained private. The pattern repeated across decades, across borders, across crises. This wasn't a conspiracy, it was design. And the most dangerous part is that it never required coordination, only alignment. Incentives did the work. Markets enforced discipline, governments adjusted accordingly. What looked like coincidence was simply structure behaving as intended. Italy did not lose control overnight, it slowly outsourced it to dynasties that understood something fundamental about modern power. You do not need to rule people if you own what they depend on. By the time this story reaches the present, the question is no longer whether these families exist. The question is whether any nation ever truly escaped them. Because once power becomes invisible, removing it becomes almost impossible. And this was only the beginning. Long before Italy became a country, it was already an economy. That distinction matters more than most people realize. Centuries before Rome governed a unified nation, Italian city-states governed money. Florence, Venice, Genoa, Milan, these were not cultural capitals first, they were financial laboratories. Banking families issued credit across Europe while kings still ruled through force. Merchants insured ships, priced risk, and moved capital faster than any army could march. Power here was never centralized, it was modular. And that made it durable. When empires collapsed, the families remained. When borders shifted, contracts survived. When monarchs defaulted on their debts, it was not armies that punished them. It was lenders who simply stopped funding their wars. Entire dynasties fell not to rebellion but to insolvency. This was Italy's original advantage. By the time other nations built strong states, Italy had already built strong private systems, guilds that regulated trade, banks that spanned continents, legal frameworks designed to protect capital long before they protected citizens. Wealth learned to move quietly, shielded by complexity, so when Italy finally unified in the 19th century, it inherited a problem no constitution could fix. The state was new, the owners were ancient, unification was celebrated as a political miracle, but economically it was a compromise. The new Italian government needed legitimacy, infrastructure, and industrial growth. The families needed stability, access, and legal recognition of assets accumulated over centuries. The deal was never written down, but it was understood. Rome would govern. They would own. Railways expanded across the peninsula, but who financed them? Steel mills rose in the north, but who controlled supply? Ports modernized, but who set the terms of trade? Over and over again, the answer was the same. The state announced progress. Private capital executed it. By the early 20th century, a pattern had solidified. Industrial dynasties embedded themselves so deeply into the economy that removing them would mean dismantling the nation itself. Employment, tax revenue, exports, entire categories of economic life flowed through a small number of corporate networks. And then came the shock. World War I devastated Europe, but it also accelerated industrial consolidation. Smaller competitors collapsed. State spending exploded. Inflation wiped out savings. Those with access to hard assets, land, factories, energy emerged stronger than before. Italy's industrial families absorbed the damage and expanded quietly. Fascism did not break this system, it formalized it. Mussolini spoke of national strength, but his regime relied heavily on private industrialists to deliver it. Autarky required factories. Militarization required steel. Infrastructure required capital. The state needed execution, and execution came from families that already controlled production. They adapted again. Publicly, they aligned. Privately, they insulated. When the regime fell, then came World War II. Italy was bombed, occupied, fractured. Cities lay in ruins. Millions were displaced. And once again, the state was weak precisely when capital was strong. Reconstruction demanded speed. Ideology mattered less than capacity. Whoever could rebuild fastest would shape the future. Enter the post-war miracle. The Marshall Plan injected billions of dollars, tens of billions in today's terms, into Europe. But money does not rebuild nations on its own. It flows through channels. In Italy, those channels already existed. Industrial families positioned themselves as indispensable intermediaries between foreign capital and domestic reconstruction. Factories were built. Energy grids expanded. Chemical plants multiplied. Automotive supply chains stretched across borders. On paper, Italy modernized rapidly. In reality, ownership consolidated further. By the 1960s, Italy was an industrial powerhouse, and its power was privately held. Entire regions depended on single conglomerates. One employer meant one political reality. Local governments learned quickly which decisions could be made and which could not. Labor unrest was negotiated not with ministries but with boardrooms. National policy bent subtly around private constraints. This wasn't domination. It was dependence, and dependence is far more stable. When the global economy slowed in the 1970s, Italy's public finances deteriorated. Inflation surged, debt ballooned. The state needed financing. Once again, it turned to those who controlled capital markets, industrial output, and international connections. By then, the families were no longer just Italian, they were European. Joint ventures in Germany, energy partnerships in France, financial exposure in London, offshore structures that blurred nationality entirely. Italy was the base, not the boundary. You have to understand something crucial. The state was always playing catch up. By the time laws were written, structures had already evolved. By the time regulation arrived, ownership had already shifted. Power moved at the speed of contracts, not legislation. This is why scandals never changed anything fundamental. Individuals fell. Companies rebranded. But the architecture remained. Too many jobs depended on it. Too much debt was entangled within it. Too many pensions, exports, and supply chains rested on its stability. Breaking it apart would mean breaking Italy. And so no one did. What emerged instead was an unspoken equilibrium. The state managed appearances, the families managed reality. Elections shifted rhetoric. Ownership did not. By the late 20th century, Italy no longer needed to be ruled overtly. It had already been built to obey silently, and the system was about to scale beyond anything its founders could have imagined. Power rarely announces itself. It settles in, slowly, methodically, layer by layer, until removing it feels unthinkable. By the time Italy entered the late 20th century, the question was no longer who owned what. Ownership had become too fragmented, too abstract, too legally insulated to trace easily. The real question was simpler and far more dangerous. Who could stop things from working? Because in modern economies, control does not come from commanding action. It comes from the ability to withhold it. Factories do not need to be seized if they can be paused. Energy grids do not need to be nationalized if supply can be priced. Governments do not need to be overthrown if they can be constrained. The families understood this intuitively. They designed systems where disruption was always an option and stability always came at a price. Consider employment. In industrial regions across northern Italy, a single conglomerate often employed tens of thousands directly. and hundreds of thousands indirectly. Suppliers, logistics firms, maintenance contractors, local banks exposed to payroll cycles, entire municipal budgets tied to tax revenue from one corporate ecosystem. In theory, labor laws protected workers. In practice, leverage protected employers. When negotiations stalled, production slowed. When regulations tightened, investment shifted. Nothing dramatic, nothing illegal. Just enough pressure to remind governments how fragile growth really was, how quickly unemployment numbers could rise, how easily elections could be lost. This was not blackmail. It was arithmetic. Then there was finance. By the 1980s, Italy's public debt had become a structural feature of its economy. Servicing it required constant access to capital markets. Bonds had to be issued. Interest rates had to be managed. Confidence had to be maintained, and confidence, more than anything else, is psychological. Private financial institutions understood this well. Italian industrial families didn't just own factories, they owned banks, or sat on their boards, or controlled investment vehicles deeply intertwined with state financing. When the Treasury issued debt, it moved through channels already shaped by private interests. When markets wobbled, reassurance came from familiar names. Stability had, and that cost was influence. Policy did not need to be dictated, it only needed to be nudged. Infrastructure projects favored certain suppliers. Energy strategies aligned with existing assets. Privatizations were framed as efficiency reforms but executed in ways that preserved insider advantage. Everything was legal. Everything was rational. Everything benefited those already positioned to benefit. By the time the European Union began pushing deeper economic integration, Italy's industrial networks were ready. While governments debated sovereignty, private capital prepared for scale. Borders mattered less, regulations harmonized, markets expanded. This was not globalization imposed from above, it was leverage scaling outward. Italian conglomerates embedded themselves into European supply chains so deeply that disentangling them would disrupt entire industries. Automotive components flowed across borders seamlessly. Energy contracts spanned decades. Infrastructure financing crossed currencies. Risk was distributed just enough to make failure systemic, and systemic risk changes behavior. When crisis hit, ideology fades. What matters is containment. The 1990s were supposed to be an era of reform. Anti-corruption investigations shook Italy's political class. Parties collapsed. Public trust evaporated. For a moment, it looked like the system might reset. It didn't. Politicians fell. Ownership didn't. Assets were restructured. Names changed. Holdings were consolidated. The machinery adjusted quietly. If anything, chaos strengthened those with patience and capital. When uncertainty rises, liquidity becomes power. Those who can buy when others must sell always emerge stronger. And they did. By the time the euro was introduced, Italy's fate was tied not just to its own economy, but to Europe's. Monetary policy centralized, fiscal constraints tightened, national flexibility narrowed. But private networks adapted instantly. They arbitraged rules, shifted liabilities, optimized structures across jurisdictions. The state once again lagged behind. You have to understand something essential here. Control does not require intent, it requires position. No family needed to plot domination. They simply occupied the intersections where money, labor, and policy met. From there, outcomes followed naturally. When incentives aligned, behavior aligned. When risks threatened the system, protection arrived. Bailouts were framed as necessity, subsidies as stability, regulatory leniency as pragmatism. Losses were absorbed quietly by the public. Profits remained private, shielded by layers of legal distance. This wasn't moral failure, it was structural inevitability, and it trained governments over time. Taught them what was possible and what was not, what could be challenged and what had to be accommodated. Ministers learned the boundaries quickly. Pushed too far, and consequences followed, not threats but numbers. Capital flight, credit tightening, investment delays. Silence spoke loudly. By the early 2000s, Italy had a functioning democracy operating inside an economic architecture it no longer fully controlled. Decisions were made, but within corridors shaped by private constraints. Freedom existed, but only within tolerances set elsewhere. The most effective systems of power do not crush resistance, they make resistance impractical. And the most dangerous thing about this one was how normal it felt. No uniforms, no slogans, no visible enemy, just balance sheets, contracts, and dependencies woven so tightly into daily life that pulling at them risked collapse. Italy didn't fall under control, it adjusted to it. And in doing so, it helped perfect a model that would soon be exported far beyond its borders. Integration was sold as liberation. A continent once torn apart by war would bind itself together through trade, shared rules, and economic interdependence. Borders would soften, markets would deepen, prosperity would spread evenly, or so the promise went. For governments, the European project was about peace and cooperation. For those who already controlled capital, it was about expansion. Italy's industrial dynasties understood immediately what a unified Europe really meant. Not ideology but access, not flags but scale. When regulations harmonize and barriers fall, those with existing infrastructure gain an advantage that newcomers cannot replicate. Europe did not level the playing field, it enlarged it, and the families were ready. Factories that once served domestic markets were repositioned as continental hubs. Logistics networks stretched across borders. Ownership structures were redesigned to move seamlessly between jurisdictions. What had once been Italian industry became European industry with Italian roots quietly embedded at the core. The state celebrated exports, ownership celebrated reach. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Europe was privatizing aggressively. State assets were sold off in the name of efficiency. Utilities, energy firms, transportation networks, telecommunications governed these moves as modernization. In reality, they were redistributions, but not downward. Those with capital, experience, and political access were best positioned to buy. Italian conglomerates partnered with foreign investors, formed consortia, and acquired strategic stakes, sometimes openly, sometimes through layers of intermediaries that obscured the final beneficiary. What mattered was not control on paper, it was influence in practice. Energy is a perfect example. Energy is not just another sector. It is leverage disguised as infrastructure. Control pricing and you shape inflation, control supply and you shape policy, control long-term contracts and you shape governments. Italian-linked firms positioned themselves early in pipeline, power generation and distribution networks across southern and eastern Europe. These were not flashy acquisitions, they were patient ones. 30-year contracts, joint ventures with partial state ownership, risk-sharing arrangements that made governments dependent partners. When energy prices rose, households blamed markets, markets blamed geopolitics, and the owners stayed invisible. Then came the euro. Monetary union removed a powerful tool from national governments. Devaluation was no longer an option. Interest rates converged, capital flowed more freely. For countries like Italy, this created tension. Productivity lagged. Debt remained a fiscal, flexibility shrank. For private capital, it was a gift. Borrowing became cheaper. Cross-border financing easier. Risk could be spread across a larger pool. Conglomerates refinanced, expanded, and consolidated while states tightened belts. The gap between public constraint and private freedom widened quietly, and with it, dependence deepened. European institutions preached competition, but consolidation accelerated. Antitrust enforcement lagged behind corporate innovation. By the time regulators noticed concentration, it was already systemic. Breaking it apart would have disrupted entire regions. No one wanted to be responsible for that, so they compromised. Rules were enforced selectively, exceptions multiplied, strategic industries were quietly protected from scrutiny. Stability was always the justification. Stability for jobs, stability for markets, stability for voters, and stability always favored incumbents. You have to understand something crucial. European integration did not erase national power struggles, displaced them. Decisions that once triggered domestic backlash now occurred at a distance. Brussels became a buffer. Accountability blurred, responsibility diffused. This suited those who preferred quiet continuity over visible authority. Italian industrial networks adapted faster than governments ever could. They staffed Brussels offices, participated in advisory panels, shaped technical standards that seemed neutral but locked in existing advantages. When policy is written in technical language, only those who helped write it fully understand its consequences. This was not corruption, it was proximity. By the time Eastern Europe opened up after the Cold War, the pattern repeated. Privatization created opportunity. Institutions were weak. Western capital moved in quickly. Italian firms partnered, invested, acquired. Manufacturing shifted east. Costs dropped. Profits rose. Local governments welcomed the jobs. Ownership remained distant. Europe's industrial map was being redrawn, but not randomly. It followed paths laid decades earlier by families who understood something fundamental: integration rewards those already integrated. By the early 2000s, Italy's influence could no longer be measured by GDP alone. Its industrial fingerprints were everywhere. In automotive supply chains, in construction contracts, in energy grids, in financial exposure quietly linking banks, firms, and states. Italy did not dominate Europe politically. It embedded itself economically. And embedded power is the hardest kind to remove. Because once multiple countries depend on the same networks, no single government can challenge them alone. Risk becomes shared, responsibility becomes diluted. Action becomes slow. This is how systems protect themselves, not through force, through interdependence. By the time Europe faced its next major crisis, these networks were no longer national assets. They were continental liabilities. And when liabilities turn systemic, the question is never who caused the problem. It is who must pay to keep the system alive. Crises expose what stability hides. They strip systems down to their load-bearing structures and reveal who carries weight and who merely collects returns. For Italy and for Europe, the first true stress test of the new order arrived not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, grinding unraveling. By the early 2000s, Italy's public debt hovered at levels that would have triggered panic in smaller economies. Well over 100% of GDP, servicing it required constant confidence from markets that had grown increasingly impatient. Growth was slow. Productivity lagged, wages stagnated. But ownership had already adapted. Private capital had learned how to live without borders. Conglomerates diversified geographically. Profits were booked in low-tax jurisdictions. Liabilities were spread across subsidiaries. Risk was sliced thin, layered, and sold through financial instruments that few regulators fully understood. What remained anchored domestically were jobs, infrastructure, and political consequences. When growth faltered, the state absorbed the strain. This asymmetry was not accidental. European owned companies to arbitrage regulation while states remained nationally constrained. Governments collected taxes where activity occurred, but value increasingly accumulated elsewhere. The result was predictable shrinking public revenue, rising social pressure, and fewer tools to respond. Then came 2008. The global financial crisis was framed as an American problem that spilled outward. In reality, it exposed fragilities that had been building for decades. Credit froze, demand collapsed, banks teetered, governments scrambled. Once again, ideology evaporated. What mattered was preventing collapse. Italian and European industrial networks faced losses that, if realized fully, would have cascaded through employment, banking, and public finances. Allowing them to fail was not an option, not because they were virtuous, but because they were entangled. Too many pensions were invested in their bonds. Too many municipalities depended on their tax contributions. Too many banks held their debt. Failure would have been contagious, so intervention followed. Public money stabilized private balance sheets. Liquidity flowed from central banks, guarantees replaced capital. Losses were socialized quietly, framed as emergency measures. Once stability returned, profits resumed their private trajectory. This pattern was not unique to Italy. But Italy was particularly exposed as austerity tightened across Europe. Public services were cut, wages stagnated further. Youth unemployment soared, entire generations felt locked out of prosperity. Yet core industrial assets remained protected, deemed too strategic to disrupt. You have to understand something essential. Systemic importance is the ultimate shield. Once a company, a network, or a sector becomes large enough, accountability shifts. Failure is no longer treated as consequence, it is treated as threat, and threats are neutralized, not punished. Italian-linked conglomerates had reached this threshold quietly. Not through size alone, but through interconnectedness. Their collapse would have destabilized multiple countries simultaneously. That made them untouchable. Meanwhile, politics absorbed the anger. Populist movements surged. Anti-EU rhetoric spread. Governments rose and fell rapidly. But structural arrangements endured. Elections changed tone, not architecture. The same constraints reappeared regardless of who won. Because debt does not negotiate. By the 2010s, Italy found itself trapped, bound by European fiscal rules, dependent on market confidence, pressured by demographics. The state could not spend freely, it could not devalue, it could not meaningfully restructure without risking contagion. Private capital, however, remained flexible. When returns fell domestically, investment shifted abroad. When labor costs rose, production relocated. When regulation tightened, structures evolved. Capital moved faster than politics ever could. This created a psychological shift. Citizens began to feel powerless even when voting. Decisions seemed distant. Outcomes felt predetermined. Trust eroded, not because democracy vanished, but because its scope narrowed. You could choose leaders, you could not choose leverage. The most striking element of this era was normalization. What would have caused outrage decades earlier became background noise. Bailouts were routine. Corporate sacrifice framed as responsibility. Private extraction framed as efficiency. Language softened reality. Losses became adjustments. Cuts became reforms. Inequality became competitiveness. And behind it all, ownership continued to consolidate. Not dramatically, incrementally. Each crisis justified a small exception. Each exception became precedent. Each precedent narrowed the future over time. The system trained itself to protect what already existed. This is how power survives without defending itself, by embedding its survival into the definition of stability. By the time Italy and Europe emerged from the crisis years, the structure was clearer than ever. Profits flowed globally. Risks settled locally. Responsibility was diffuse. Accountability elusive. No one was fully in charge, but no one could dismantle it either. The system had achieved something remarkable. It had removed owners from consequence. And once ownership becomes consequence-free, it becomes permanent. What followed was not collapse, it was endurance, and endurance in systems like this is the most dangerous phase of all. From the outside, nothing looked broken. Italy still held elections. Parties campaigned. Parliaments debated. Newspapers argued. Power appeared to rotate. But appearances can be deceptive, especially when the most important decisions are no longer made where the cameras are. Democracy was still alive, it was just contained. By the mid-2010s, the limits had become impossible to ignore. Governments could change tax rates at the margins, adjust welfare programs, reform labor laws. But the core questions, ownership, leverage, systemic risk, were largely off limits, not because they were illegal to discuss, but because acting on them carried consequences no elected official wanted to absorb. Markets react faster than voters. A single statement could move bond yields. A draft policy could trigger capital flight. A reform proposal could freeze investment. None of this required coordination. Algorithms, analysts, and institutions enforced discipline automatically. This is how economic cages work. They don't lock you in with force. They condition you with feedback. Italian leaders learned this lesson repeatedly. When reform went too far, borrowing costs crept upward. When rhetoric spooked investors, confidence wavered. When stability was restored, markets relaxed. The message was consistent: govern freely within boundaries or pay immediately. Over time, this shaped political behavior more effectively than any law. Ambition narrowed. Platforms softened. Radical proposals were quietly abandoned before reaching parliament. Not because leaders lacked conviction, but because the cost of conviction had become measurable in real time. You have to understand something. Democracy assumes choice. Markets assume compliance. When the two conflict, markets tend to win, not because they are malicious, but because they are relentless. They do not pause for debate. They do not wait for consensus, they simply respond. And response becomes control. Italian industrial networks existed comfortably within this environment. They did not need to lobby aggressively, they did not need to threaten. Their importance was already priced into the system. Banks knew it, governments knew it, workers felt it. This created a strange inversion. Politicians spoke the language of sovereignty while managing dependence. Citizens blamed leaders for outcomes leaders could not fully influence. Anger moved downward, never upward, because the architecture above remained abstract. Who do you vote against when ownership is invisible? Even when populist movements surged, promising rupture, reality intervened quickly. Campaigns were loud. Governance was quiet. Once in office, constraints reappeared. Budgets had to balance, credit had to roll over. Commitments had to be honored. The system absorbed rebellion without changing shape. This wasn't repression, it was absorption. And it worked because it offered just enough flexibility to survive. Minor concessions, symbolic conflicts, rotating villains, all while the underlying structure continued uninterrupted. By now, Italian capital was no longer fully Italian. It was multinational, financialized, dispersed. Pension funds in North America held stakes. European banks underwrote debt, global institutions provided liquidity. Responsibility blurred further. This diffusion made confrontation even harder. Any serious challenge would not hit one target. It would ripple outward, triggering consequences far beyond Italy's borders, jobs elsewhere, banks elsewhere, savings elsewhere. The threat of contagion neutralized political will before action began. Stability became sacred, and stability meant continuity. The irony was painful. Italy's democratic institutions remained, but their capacity to shape economic destiny had eroded. Citizens sensed it instinctively. They felt squeezed between rising costs and stagnant incomes. Rent climbed. Housing grew scarce. Pensions looked fragile. Yet the explanations offered were always external. Global forces, European rules. Univoidal reality, rarely structure, rarely leverage. This selective blindness was not accidental, it was cultural. For decades, Italians had been taught to see chaos in politics and order in markets. But markets were never neutral. They reflected power just as politics did, only with better insulation. By the late 2010s, a quiet consensus had formed among elites. Radical change was too dangerous, incremental adjustment was acceptable. Crises would be managed, not solved, growth would be modest, inequality tolerated. The system no longer aimed to inspire, it aimed to persist. And persistence became the ultimate measure of success. This is how democracy survives inside a cage. It moves. It breathes, it speaks. But it does not roam. The boundaries are invisible yet absolute. Step too far and pressure arrives, not with force but with numbers. Interest rates, spreads, confidence. Italy did not lose its voice, it lost its range. And as long as the structure remained intact, no election could restore it. The question was no longer whether democracy mattered. The question was whether it still had room to act, because when power becomes systemic, even good intentions become irrelevant. And by now, the system had become very good at protecting itself. Power does not always pass through blood. Sometimes it passes through systems so stable they feel permanent. By the time Italy entered the 2020s, a generational shift was underway. Not in ownership that had barely moved, but in experience. A new generation came of age having never known a different economic reality. High youth unemployment. Precarious contracts, housing that consumed half a paycheck, debt that followed people longer than opportunity ever did. To them, stagnation felt normal, and that was the inheritance. Their parents had lived through growth, post-war expansion, rising wages, social mobility, the promise that each decade would be better than the last. That promise died quietly somewhere between deregulation and crisis management, replaced by a more modest expectation: survival. The structure that enabled elite endurance had matured. It no longer needed active defense. It simply reproduced itself. Ownership passed not dramatically but administratively. Trusts, foundations, holding companies. Succession plans designed to minimize exposure, maximize continuity, and ensure that names could disappear while control remained intact. The public rarely noticed transitions because nothing visibly changed. Factories kept running. Dividends kept flowing. Governments kept negotiating. This was power without personality, and that made it resilient. Unlike earlier eras where figures could be targeted or regimes dismantled, this system offered no single face. No headquarters to store and oppose. Even investigative journalists struggled to map it fully. Structures were legal, fragmented, cross-border. Influence was exercised through normal channels: investment decisions, hiring freezes, capital allocation. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just consequences. For younger Italians, the disconnect was stark. Education promised mobility, but markets delivered constraint. Degrees multiplied. Opportunities didn't. Many left. Britain, Germany, the United States. A quiet brain drain that further weakened domestic renewal. Those who stayed adjusted expectations downward. This wasn't apathy, it was adaptation. You have to understand something deeply unsettling. Systems don't need consent to endure. They need resignation. And resignation spreads quietly, especially when alternatives feel unrealistic. The irony was that Italy's industrial dynasties did not need to suppress dissent. Dissatisfaction targeted politics, not structure. Anger cycled through parties and personalities. Meanwhile, ownership remained untouched, sheltered by complexity and distance. The system had learned a powerful lesson: visibility creates vulnerability, so it remained discreet. As global attention shifted to tech giants and financial crises elsewhere, Europe's old industrial networks slipped beneath the radar. They weren't flashy, they didn't dominate headlines. But they owned the less glamorous foundations of modern life: energy, materials, logistics, infrastructure. Things you only notice when they fail. And failure was carefully managed. Even climate transition, framed as disruption, became opportunity. Green investments flowed through existing channels. Renewable infrastructure favored incumbents with scale and access. Subsidies rewarded those who could navigate bureaucracy. Once again, adaptation preserved advantage. The language changed, the structure didn't. Meanwhile, public discourse fractured, culture wars intensified. Identity debates consumed attention. Economic architecture remained background noise, complex, boring, difficult to mobilize against, perfectly designed to avoid scrutiny. This fragmentation was not orchestrated, it was useful. When societies argue horizontally, power accumulates vertically. By now, Italy's role in Europe had become paradoxical, politically constrained, economically embedded, too big to fail quietly, too entangled to reform aggressively. Every attempt at change encountered the same question, unspoken but decisive: what happens next? No one had a satisfying answer. Breaking up conglomerates risked unemployment. Renationalization risked market backlash. Radical reform risked capital flight. Doing nothing risked slow decline. Every path carried cost. The system didn't need to block alternatives. It only needed to make them painful. And so continuity won by default. This is how elite power evolves in mature democracies. Not through domination, but through exhaustion. Not through secrecy, but through complexity. Not through fear, but through inevitability. By the time the next crisis loomed, whether financial, energy, or geopolitical, the question was no longer whether the system would be challenged. It was whether anyone remembered how to challenge it effectively. Because once a structure outlives resistance, it becomes history, and history, unlike politics, rarely gets voted out. What Italy inherited was not just debt or stagnation, it inherited a design. One built long before most citizens were born, one that continued to shape their lives quietly, predictably, and without asking permission. The final act of power is not control, it is normalization. And this system had mastered it. The most effective form of power is the one people stopped looking for. By the time Italy reached this stage, control no longer felt imposed. It felt ambient, like gravity, present unquestioned, shaping movement without ever being seen. Power no longer needed to assert itself because it had already shaped the environment in which choices were made. This is the final evolution of elite systems. They disappear, not literally. Financial statements still exist. Ownership still matters, decisions are still made, but the connection between cause and effect becomes so stretched, so mediated that responsibility dissolves. Outcomes appear natural, inevitable, beyond human design. Rents rise because markets demand it. Wages stagnate because competitiveness requires it. Public services shrink because budgets allow nothing else. Each explanation is technically true, and collectively misleading. What vanishes is the idea that these conditions were constructed and could, in theory, be reconstructed differently. Italy's industrial dynasties understood this phase better than any before. They stopped defending their role because no one was directly accusing them anymore. Criticism had migrated elsewhere, to globalization, to technology, to bureaucracy, to voters themselves. Blame became diffuse, and diffuse blame is harmless. By now, the system's greatest strength was that it no longer needed loyalty, it only required predictability. As long as governments remained cautious, markets remained calm. As long as markets remained calm, capital stayed put. As long as capital stayed put, employment survived, barely but enough. Enough to avoid revolt, enough to maintain order, enough to keep questioning abstract. This equilibrium produced a strange calm, not prosperity, but managed decline. Not collapse, but containment. Italy became a country where nothing catastrophic happened, but nothing transformative could either. That was the design's quiet triumph. Even investigative exposure struggled to penetrate it. Every revelation met a shrug. Everyone already knew something was wrong. What no one could agree on was where to intervene. The system offered no single lever. Pulling one caused strain elsewhere. Power had fragmented itself deliberately. Invisibility is not absence, it is insulation. And insulation protects against heat, against pressure, against accountability. You have to understand something subtle but critical. This system does not need secrecy to survive, it needs complexity. Complexity exhausts attention. It deters engagement, it rewards specialists and alienates citizens. Over time, people stop asking who benefits and focus instead on how to cope. Coping becomes culture. In Italy, coping looked like family support replacing state support. Informal economies filling formal gaps. Emigration substituting opportunity. Political cynicism replacing expectation. None of this threatened ownership. In fact, it stabilized it. Because systems endure not when people are content, but when they are tired. At the European level, the pattern was identical. Crises were managed just enough to prevent rupture. Energy shocks were cushioned temporarily. Financial instability was backstopped. Each intervention reinforced the same lesson: collapse would not be allowed, but reform would not be prioritized either. Stability became the ceiling, and beneath that ceiling, power settled permanently. What made this stage especially dangerous was moral neutrality. No villains, no grand betrayal, just rational actors responding to incentives inside structures they did not create but learned to navigate. Even those at the top could plausibly deny intent. They were merely optimizing, merely adapting, merely fulfilling fiduciary duty, and perhaps they were. That is what makes systems like this so hard to dismantle. They do not rely on bad people. They rely on aligned incentives. Remove one actor, another takes their place. Change a government, constraints reassert themselves. The architecture persists. Italy's story at this point was no longer uniquely Italian. It was a preview. A case study in how advanced democracies quietly transfer control without declaring it. How power migrates from visible institutions to invisible ones without ever staging a coup. The flag still flies, the anthem still plays, but decisions live elsewhere. This is not the end of democracy. It is its compression. A narrowing of scope so gradual that few notice until it feels permanent. And permanence is the most seductive illusion of all, because nothing built by humans is permanent, not even this. But undoing invisible power requires something modern societies have grown uncomfortable with: sustained attention, collective patience, and a willingness to confront complexity without simplifying it into villains or slogans. Whether Italy, and Europe more broadly, still possesses that capacity is an open question. What is clear is this: power did not vanish, it learned how to hide. And when power hides successfully, it doesn't need to be defended, it simply waits. Silence is never neutral, it has a price and someone always pays it. By the time Italy reached this stage, the cost of maintaining the system was no longer hidden, it was merely normalized. The burden had shifted steadily downward, away from ownership and toward everyday life. It showed up not as a single shock but as a constant pressure. Subtle grinding, unavoidable rent-first housing stopped being shelter and became an asset class. In cities and industrial hubs, prices detached from wages entirely, ownership concentrated, young families delayed stability. Multi-generational living returned not as culture but as necessity. Property appreciation rewarded those already inside. Everyone else paid monthly tribute for access, then wages. Productivity gains no longer translated into income growth. Flexibility became policy. Temporary contracts replaced security. Workers were told this was adaptation, competitiveness, modernization. In reality, it was risk being transferred downward. When markets fluctuated, labor absorbed the shock. Debt filled the gap. Households borrowed to maintain standards that wages no longer supported. Credit cards, student loans, mortgages stretched over lifetimes. Public debt was discussed endlessly, but private indebtedness became the quiet stabilizer. Debt disciplines behavior, it makes people cautious, compliant, focused on survival rather than structure. This is not accidental. Highly leveraged societies are orderly societies. They do not riot easily. They do not disrupt supply chains. They do not challenge systems they cannot afford to interrupt. Italian elites did not need to design this consciously, the incentives did it for them. Financialization rewarded asset holders, labor flexibility rewarded employers, fiscal restraint rewarded creditors. The outcome was predictable, and it was framed as inevitability. Every conversation returned to constraints, European rules, market reactions, global competition. There was always a reason nothing fundamental could change, always a warning attached to ambition. You have to understand something crucial. Silence is produced, not through censorship but through repetition. When people are told often that alternatives are unrealistic, they stop imagining them. When complexity overwhelms debate, disengagement feels rational. When effort produces no visible change, withdrawal becomes self-preservation. This is how systems protect themselves without force, by exhausting resistance. By the late 2010s, this exhaustion was visible everywhere. Voter turnout declined, trust in institutions eroded, cynicism replaced expectation. Politics became theater rather than vehicle. Anger cycled, but outcomes did not. Meanwhile, ownership continued to benefit quietly. Returns flowed upward. Risks flowed downward. Stability was maintained just enough to avoid rupture. The system did not need growth, it needed continuity. And continuity came at a human cost. Delayed families, mental health strain. A generation raised to expect less, not because resources were scarce, but because access was controlled. Italy was not poor, it was constrained. That distinction matters, because scarcity can mobilize, constraint numbs. At the European level, the same pattern held. Southern economies absorbed adjustment, northern capital accumulated surplus. The language of responsibility masked asymmetry. Everyone was told to tighten belts, but some belts were never touched. Again, this was not framed as injustice. It was framed as arithmetic. Markets demand confidence. Budgets demand discipline. Confidence and discipline always travel in one direction. The most striking feature of this era was how little outrage it produced. Not because people were content, but because outrage had nowhere to land. There was no clear antagonist. No villainous decree, just outcomes produced by systems no single actor controlled. This diffusion of responsibility was the final shield. You cannot protest a balance sheet, you cannot vote out a supply chain, you cannot shame an algorithm, and so silence prevailed. Not because people agreed, but because disagreement felt futile. Yet silence has consequences. It teaches power that it can persist without explanation. It teaches systems that endurance is enough. It teaches future generations that nothing fundamental is possible. That is the real inheritance, not debt, not stagnation, but lowered expectation. Italy's story is not one of collapse. It is one of quiet accommodation, a slow acceptance that the boundaries are fixed, that the structure is permanent, that resistance is symbolic at best. This acceptance is what allowed the system to mature fully, and maturity in systems like this is dangerous, because once a structure survives long enough, it stops needing justification, it simply exists. The cost of silence is not paid immediately. It compounds. And eventually, someone always asks whether the price was worth it. The question is not whether Italy paid it. The question is who will pay next. Every system eventually reveals its true purpose, not in moments of ambition, but in moments of exhaustion. When growth slows, when crises repeat, when promises shrink, what remains tells you what the system was really built to protect. In Italy's case, what remains is continuity, not prosperity, not dynamism, not renewal, continuity. The industrial dynasties that learned to survive empires, fascism, war, integration, globalization, and crisis did not do so by resisting change. They survived by shaping it, by positioning themselves where adaptation was rewarded and accountability was diffused, by ensuring that whatever the political weather, the underlying architecture bent but never broke. This was never about Italy alone. Italy was simply the clearest case study. What emerged there: quiet ownership, structural dependence, privatized gain, and socialized risk spread because it worked. It produced stability without equality, order without legitimacy, growth without distribution. For modern systems under pressure, this trade-off proved tempting, and it became normalized. You have to understand something important. Power does not need to be evil to be dangerous. It only needs to be insulated from consequence. Once insulation is complete, incentives dominate. Decisions optimize for continuity, not justice, for preservation, not possibility. Over time, the system stops asking what it should do and focuses entirely on what it must do to survive. That is where Italy stands now, not captured, not collapsed, but locked into a narrow corridor of outcomes. Small adjustments allowed, major shifts discouraged. Every path forward evaluated not on merit but on risk to the structure. This is the silent victory of modern power. It does not conquer, it conditions. It teaches societies what is realistic and what is naive. It reframes ambition as irresponsibility. It rebrands restraint as maturity. And eventually it convinces people that the world they inhabit is simply how things are. But systems like this contain a paradox. The very mechanisms that make them stable also make them fragile. Dependence reduces resilience. Concentration amplifies shock. Insulation breeds complacency. When adaptation replaces accountability for long enough, blind spots form. Risks accumulate quietly, just as power once did. Italy's story is a warning, not a prophecy. It shows what happens when ownership becomes abstract, when democracy loses economic range, when stability becomes sacred and questioning becomes fatigue. It shows how easily societies can trade agency for order without realizing the cost until it feels permanent. Yet permanence is an illusion. Every system that feels immovable eventually encounters something it cannot absorb: a demographic shift, a technological rupture, a geopolitical shock, a loss of legitimacy that no amount of liquidity can repair. When that moment arrives, invisible power becomes suddenly visible again, and visibility changes everything. The question is not whether this structure can last forever. It cannot. The question is whether societies will recognize it before collapse forces recognition upon them. Whether citizens will relearn how to see power not as chaos or conspiracy, but as architecture designed, maintained, adjustable. If confronted deliberately, Italy's future, like Europe's, will not be decided by slogans or elections alone. It will be decided by whether economic structures are allowed to remain unquestioned simply because questioning them is uncomfortable. Because comfort has been the system's greatest ally, silence its most reliable defense, and normalization its final shield. If there is a lesson here, it is not that elites are omnipotent. It is that systems endure when people stop believing they can be changed. Power settles when attention moves on. And once settled, it does not announce itself again. It waits for exhaustion, for distraction, for the next generation to inherit a world they did not design, yet are expected to accept. Italy did not lose its sovereignty in a single moment. It leased pieces of it quietly over decades in exchange for stability. Whether that trade was worth the cost is still an open question, but the structure it produced now stands as a mirror, not just for Italy, for any society that mistakes calm for control and endurance for justice. Because when power becomes quiet enough, the most radical act is simply to notice it. And noticing after so much silence is where everything begins.